We already learned that to consume the API, the consumer sends an HTTP request using an HTTP method like GET. He then gets back an HTTP response which contains a status code. It's really important to get these right because these status codes are the only thing a consumer of an API, like a client-side web app, can inspect to know whether a request worked out as expected, and if something went wrong, whether it's the fault of the consumer or the fault of the API itself. Imagine you're sending back a 200 OK status code for each and every request. The consumer would assume that his request worked out as expected, even if it went wrong. And imagine that when something goes wrong, we'd only send back a 500 internal server error. The consumer would never know it's their fault something went wrong. For example, sending a GET request for a city that doesn't exist, meaning the consumer can correct it and try the request again. Or if it's the server's responsibility, in which case the client shouldn't try and correct the mistake, because the mistake isn't the mistake the client made. There's a lot of status codes, and an API doesn't necessarily have to support all of them. But let's look into a few common ones. There's 5 levels of status codes. Level 100 status codes are informational. They're typically not used by APIs. The level 200 status codes mean the request went well. The most common ones are a 200 OK for the successful GET request, a 201 created for the successful request that resulted in the creation of a new resource, and 204 no content for the successful request that shouldn't return anything, like delete. Level 300 status codes are used for redirection, for example to tell a search engine that a page has permanently moved. Most APIs don't have a need for these. Then there's the status codes that tell consumers they did something wrong. Level 400 status codes. Client mistakes, in other words. 400 means bad request. The request you, as a consumer of the API, sent to the server is wrong. For example, the JSON you provided cannot be parsed. 401 unauthorized means that no or invalid authentication details were provided. 403 forbidden means that authentication succeeded, but the authenticated user doesn't have access to the requested resource. 404 not found then means that the requested resource doesn't exist. And 409 is used for conflicts. For example, an edit conflict between 2 simultaneous updates. And lastly, there's level 500. These are server mistakes. The archetypical one to support is the 500 internal server error. This means that the server made a mistake and the client can't do anything about it other than trying again later. Let's learn how to implement this.